16 years since 9/11, but the strategy of terror attacks has changed, and this one echoing one from the Islamic State group. For more, let's speak to Marco Vicenzino, terror expert in London. Mr. Vicenzino, what did you make of this attack when you learned of it?
It followed a pattern. In 2014, ISIS made a clear statement. It was for its followers, particularly in the West, calling upon lone wolves to take up any means necessary. And amongst those means was obviously vehicular attacks by automotive vehicles. Since 2014, there's been more or less about 15 of these type of attacks in the West, roughly over 140 killed. What we saw in New York take place, I think, is just another one of those attacks within that pattern. Once again, it's cheap. You can claim as many lives as possible. It's effective that it basically it helps them in their recruiting to win headlines worldwide. It gives them a sense of that they can operate anywhere in the world, and also there's that sense of trying to create a state of fear. Now, these type of attacks cause an initial shock, but I think in most Western societies, that element of resilience has increased. In New York, the Halloween parade, which takes place every year and attracts thousands, took place last night. In New York City on Sunday, November 5th, there'll be the New York City Marathon, one of the biggest marathons in the world. It goes throughout all the 5 boroughs in New York, and it has thousands of participants. That's going to be taking place. Obviously, security will be stepped up. But it's important for society to be vigilant. You need responsible political leadership to promote that vigilance, not to create a state of fear. You need ordinary citizens. They also have a responsibility to participate in terms of reporting anything that looks suspicious, and also in the corporate sector. Private businesses, particularly those in social media, is trying to vet as much as possible online accounts that facilitate a lot of times self-radicalization. If this attack was, as most believe now, was a lone wolf attack, it's probably highly likely, like previous attacks, such as the Boston bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers, they became radicalized, much self-radicalized, but social media played that element. So there needs to be this collective effort, political leadership, ordinary citizens, and the private sector, not just in the U.S., but throughout the Western world and beyond.
You mentioned those previous attacks, these vehicular attacks. We've seen quite a few of them here in Europe, and we've seen safety measures introduced. And in the run-up to these events coming up in New York that you mentioned, how well is a city equipped to protect these so-called soft targets?
But the city is in my opinion, is as equipped as possible. The NYPD has in recent years has visited various auto rental places, probably over 140 of them alone. And NYPD, it's part of the private sector and public sector working together. So yeah, I mean, there has been, you cannot prevent every single attack. You can reduce the probability of an attack, but I think a lot of good work has been done. It's unfortunate that the failures often make the headlines, but the successes, things that are prevented, which many times aren't reported in the media, and a lot of the hard work, daily hard work being done by the NYPD, by law enforcement, by the private sector, much of that goes unreported. In my opinion, New York City is one of the best prepared in the world. But once again, this is a free society. It's an open society. It's an individual who, on an open street, runs into ordinary citizens working. These things can happen. And once again, citizens need to remain vigilant, but to avoid a state of fear. By submitting to the fear, that's caving into the objectives of the terrorists.
Now, the early reports say that the assailant was this Uzbek immigrant. Did you glean anything from his profile?
I mean, the profile you looked, it seems to be, once again, first of all, there is no single profile. It's important. You can draw parallels with other. What I thought originally was a look in terms of the Tsarnaev brothers who arrived in the U.S. Also, they're from Kyrgyz background. This individual is, from what appears, is of Uzbek background. They arrived in the U.S. at a fairly young age, and over time, the self-radicalization began in the U.S. So even if there was vetting in advance, it probably couldn't have been spotted. It's something that took place. Once they're in this society, and then it's difficult. If they don't have a criminal record and they don't have a criminal past, it's often maybe difficult to detect them unless you have them on social media and you're detecting any sort of anything troublesome that they're doing on social media. Many of these people stay below the radar screen. Their self-radicalization may take place below the radar screen. But yes, I think I would draw parallels. Listen, Central Asia is also an area where there are insurgencies. Muslim majority areas. If you look at ISIS, some of the top commanders in ISIS were from Central Asia and are from Central Asia. In the Western media, much has been focused on Westerners who have gone to Syria and Iraq, become radicalized, taken up arms there, or some of that have come back home. And obviously, you have many recruits from the Middle East and North Africa, particularly countries like Tunisia and Morocco. But I think those from Central Asia have been somewhat below the radar screen in terms of media attention. Once again, these were not individuals. The Tsarnaev brothers and this current individual did not go out into the Middle East to fight with ISIS. But once again, they seem to have been related to the social media of ISIS, self-radicalization, part of those sympathizers who ISIS may not have direct operational responsibility for many of these attacks taking place in the West, but they can claim inspirational responsibility. And often they'll come out and they'll immediately claim responsibility. And that word responsibility, it's important to distinguish. One is inspirational, one is direct operational control.
Yeah, and real quickly, just one last question. U.S. President Donald Trump promised to step up vetting measures. What do you expect we'll see from him?
I mean, I think a lot of that is rhetoric. And as much as he's wanting to do already, the U.S. institutions, whether it's the embassies overseas, the Justice Department, they may accelerate what's been already put in place. But I think what already has been put in place in the pipeline, some of it has not been able to be put in place. Some of it has been on hold by courts. Listen, the immigration issue is a very complex one. Certain of his elements that he's introduced are caught in the court systems, have been turned down at the appeals process, but also the Supreme Court has also upheld certain elements of his proposals. So it's not a black and white, it's more of a gray area, and as time goes by, I think there's much of it will still be caught in the court for the foreseeable future. But a lot of his proposed legislation, not all of it has been overturned. Once again, you have to look very clearly on what elements. So he'll continue, pushing what has become known as extreme vetting. He'll keep pushing it. It'll still play out in the courts. This shows you that this issue of terrorism goes to the very root of Western societies, of free societies worldwide. It's not just political and it's not just legal and political implications. It's also social. It's cultural, and this will be dominating particularly since 9/11. It's always once again striking that balance between civil liberties and national security. There's not a clear line. It's very much a gray zone. In France, the new legislation that's being passed this week is basically the state of emergency since the Paris attacks in 2015 have come to an end. The new legislation being passed includes many elements of the state of emergency that'll be up to review for every 2 years. But it shows you it's not just in the United States, this issue. It's in France, it's in the UK, in Germany, throughout the Western world, and free societies beyond.
All right. Thank you very much, Marco Vicenzino, for speaking to us from London.